Now we're going to focus on technology, which has come up throughout the first session, and it is one of the key areas of focus for the Middle East. Different economies, different countries are trying to position themselves as tech hubs. Huge amount of competition, as you would imagine, from established players and also emerging Asian cities that want to establish themselves as tech hubs. So here we're going to explore some of the opportunities, some of the issues, some of the obstacles, and how that industry is going to shape up. Now, there have been a number of very big successes. Careem, ride-hailing firm, started in 2012. Uber's just bought them for $3.1 billion. I think their first capital raising was $12 million, $3.1 billion back in March, and they've just closed that deal. So a huge success, bringing, focusing a bit of light on the region. In 2017, Amazon took over the Souk Group. That was about $580 million from memory. So there have been a couple of big deals. But how does the Middle East, in fact, reinvent itself as a tech hub, a region that's almost universally focused on hydrocarbons and energy? So please, I'll introduce my guest, Louis Lebbos, who's founding partner at AstroLabs, Alex Perez-Fragero, who's International Markets Director at What3Words, Emma Parsons, Regional Director, UK and Ireland for Bahrain Economic Development Board, and Visar Sala, who's Managing Director, Accenture Strategy. He's lead for the Middle East and Turkey. Please welcome my guests to the stage. I want a general question to all of you. Can the Middle East really invent itself or reinvent itself as a tech hub? We'll go into individual countries later because I think that's very important. Let's look at it regionally. Is that as an aspiration, but is it a realistic one?
Again, the short answer is yes. There is no reason why it could not, right? There is talent in the region. There is market opportunity. And there is a desire to diversify from government and create jobs and employment for the large portion of the population in the region that is under 30 years old. And I honestly don't know numbers, but it is quite big. The longer answer is it'll take time. It might not be as short as some governments want. Like we flip a switch, we put $5 billion in a startup fund, and the next day we have 5 unicorns.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't happen this way. But I think across the last 10 years that we've been involved in the startup ecosystem, there has been, like you mentioned, Careem and Souk. There's been a lot more kind of like smaller successes as well, and I think that will build, and we just need, 1 or 2 more decades to become an actual tech hub. I like to talk in decades because I think driving ecosystem takes some time, but I think there's all the components that we need. There are big obstacles. I'm not going to get into them right now, but
we will look at those. Yeah, we will. We have to. Yeah. Okay, Visar Sala, you've done some work on the region, a bit of analysis. So give us your take on this aspiration to be global tech hub.
Yeah, we're slightly a little bit more optimistic on the pace than the US now, in the sense that we looked at it. First of all, Middle East and Africa do start from a very low base in fintech. Out of 90 billion roughly spent in the last 8 years, 1% was spent there. What's interesting though, 2 things came across when we looked at it. Number one was the pace of growth. It grew the number of companies, fintechs, in 8 years, 8 times, and is projected to more than double in the next 5 years. But the most interesting is that a lot of fintechs, I was making a joke early this morning, etc. It is how much money is made out of there. A fintech nowadays requires 8 to 12 years to come to profit on average. No? In Middle East and Africa, it is between 3 and 5 years. So East and West Africa, 3 years, Middle East, 4 years, South Africa, 5 years. So it is almost half or double the speed or half the time to go to profitability. So these are the 2 things we believe we should look at it.
That's in the fintech. I'd like to explore that a bit later, so we will come back to you. Like the Bahrain experience, because we'll come to you as a startup operating in the region. But how's Bahrain going to position itself as a global tech hub?
So just to step it back a little bit, we talked this morning about direction of travel, rate of progress, and diversification of economies. Now, Bahrain was the first to find oil in the region and always knew with the amount that it had, it was going to be the first to run out. So diversification's been part and parcel of our government's approach to growing the economy since, for decades. Financial services has been one of the ways that we've done this. And perhaps in recent years, we lost a bit of our shine to one of our neighbours in terms of financial services, but it's still a highly credible, very deep, thorough, solid financial services base. And that's already innovating. So in terms of the region, tiny little Bahrain, 1.5 million people, is already leading the way on fintech innovation. So we have financial services digitizing, becoming more fintech-led. And on the wider side of it, international companies are focusing on the region, and that is leading our tech conversion. So Amazon Web Services setting up in the region. Bahrain has a cloud-first policy. Things are moving at a very, very fast pace of change. I started working for Bahrain 5 years ago. In my interview, I was really kind of, I'm coming from London, what's your fintech strategy? And I genuinely was met with blank faces. Now you look at what's happening in Bahrain. There's the Central Bank of Bahrain has a fintech unit. Open banking goes live in Bahrain at the end of this month. Two banks are already up and running. Everybody else has to be. Digital banks are set up as well. The pace of change, we were behind London, but now the pace of change is as quick, or if not quicker, than what happens in the rest of the world. And this speed and development and pace of change is not just true for Bahrain, it's true for the whole region. So in terms of moving forward as a tech hub, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And fintech specialty, obviously.
Yeah.
There. Alex, I want to come to you. Now, you're operating in the region.
Yeah.
Not everyone's a Bahrain. So what are from the Middle East, what are the regions, what are the cities, what are the areas you believe have the edge and you're looking at or operating in?
So just to explain a little bit about what 3 words, we actually sell an API essentially. So whenever we look at the region, obviously we have to look at the demand for our services, which is around e-commerce and logistics and mobility. So obviously we look at the bigger players. Now, obviously in terms of total usage of number of deliveries, etc., that's our first metric that we look at. So obviously the key players in terms of Saudi became our focus. Now, as a business, we've had to make a decision as to what is the best model to set up in that country. Culturally, obviously business in the region is very much face-to-face, trust-based, long sales cycles. So we're big believers of having Saudis in Saudi Arabia. We've been trying to hire the right people, and I think right now there's huge excitement and huge energy in Saudi Arabia for change, and driven by Vision 2030 to diversify away from oil. But there's still I'd say quite a big challenge around talent at the right price point. As in there is obviously very talented people in Saudi Arabia, but unfortunately we at this stage can't afford sort of Aramco salaries. So at the moment we have to make decisions around what is the best call around talent flying from the UK in versus talent on the ground. It's still one that we're trying to work out. But in terms of the different countries, again, from our perspective, it's very much like Saudi is a big market.
You're in
for us.
Saudi because it's the biggest market? Because it's obviously expensive.
Biggest market. We also sort of hit it in a time when it was changing a lot. I've been going there for 2 years now. So when I first landed in Saudi Arabia, women weren't allowed to drive. Now, the amount of change has been extraordinary. So we've sort of hit a bit of a sweet spot, and there are these sort of visualization success managers in every part of the business. So innovation is at the forefront of everyone's minds, and we're a bit of a step change product. So there's been a lot of development there. Obviously, we made the classic mistake of any startup. We focused too broadly. We were in UAE, Jordan, I've been to Oman, all over the place. Aramex are one of our strategic investors, so classically we tried to launch with them across the whole of the region. Biggest error. We focused then down in Saudi about 2 years ago.
Right.
So yeah, that's been our call, but that's all based on market size and opportunity.
But you're looking elsewhere in the region?
We are, as in terms of a hub.
Yeah.
We found that just scaling a team in Saudi Arabia right now is too challenging. So we're looking, and we're speaking to actually the guys at AstroLabs, to scale out of Dubai. So I'm back and forth interviewing at the moment.
So Dubai would be the next port of call for
At the moment, but maybe,
Possibly not.
I was
but
going to
possibly.
say,
So, I mean, I
have a chat.
genuinely,
Here's an opportunity sitting next to you. Yeah.
genuinely open to solutions.
But what about the international view? Because we do a lot with senior ministers from across Asia, across the region, and almost everyone says we want to develop ourselves as a tech hub. What's the international take on the region? Is it, you mentioned investment, and we'll come to that in a moment, but is it increasing in importance in and rising up the agenda of international investors, or is it still struggling at the bottom?
I'll try to answer the question as I understand it. I think for a long time, a lot of the international investment in the region was the region as a market.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of the offices across the region becoming, if you go to Google or Microsoft or Oracle offices in Dubai or, across the region, it's like 95% salespeople, right?
Yes.
Different titles, but sales, business development.
Yeah.
And I think the shift that we would like to see is, as this market is big and developing and becoming a little bit more sophisticated, right? You need to have localized products, and you cannot localize a product from Mountain View. So just like Google developing their offices in Singapore, we'd like to see some of those big organizations also investing locally to localize some of their products. So I think there is a small shift in terms of especially building data centers across the region, all of the stuff. But what we would like to see, and I don't want to be like the skeptical person, I'm actually very optimistic.
Yeah.
But when you're passionate about building the ecosystem in the region, and this is the mission of actually AstroLabs, although we're a private organization, you want to see things happen. And on the large organization side, the international organizations, we want to see more investment happen. And that's kind of like part of our discussions with them and part of our discussions with some of the governments in the region is, okay, there's a lot of money coming out of the region for these large organizations. Just like, what used to be the deal in the defense world.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of reinvestment happening. We'd like to see that in the tech world as well, because this will really accelerate the development.
So there's active talks going on or encouragement for international players to invest not just salespeople, but development, product in the region.
Exactly. I mean, and to Alex's point, the region is quite expensive. The region has people, but it's very hard to recruit top talent, right? You have, in Saudi Arabia, you have to, compete with Aramco, but now with like 1,000 new MBS organizations that are sucking the top talent in Saudi. And then in Dubai, there is talent, but one, it's small. Bahrain is small, Dubai is small, all the stuff. And then two, this talent is sometimes there for a short period of time, right?
Yeah.
We don't have the permanent residency programs and this type of stuff, which are being discussed, but discussed for years and years. So people might be there for 5, 6, 7 years, and then they leave after like really coming to like peak performance, and then go back home. And that's kind of like a obstacle. That's one of the obstacles.
One of the obstacles, yeah. Yeah, no, I would like to get onto talent in places like Bahrain as well. Visar, you said something really interesting. Your research showed that the payback for startups in the fintech world in the Middle East was 3 to 5 years as opposed to 8 to 12, I think is what you said. Why is that? Did you find a common theme in those successes?
Yes, we did, on average. Well, you have two tails. You have the East-West Africa tail, where the fintechs focused on the unbanked, and there typically the payback is faster because there is more space, less regulation, lower costs of entering, etc., etc. In the Middle East, again, it was exactly the opposite. Given that the banking sector is very regulated, so it is very tough to go into the incumbents, those that survived actually focused into solving a real problem rather than a fancy problem. And this, at the end, made them more successful. Like I could talk for hours on this. I know we don't have the time. Like, for example, rather than simply trying to give your extra service, they focused on some of them in the small business SME lending on the scoring side, which is one of the pain points of the banking system, and they were not solving. So I guess the short answer is they were forced by the dynamics in both areas to solve problems which would have an earlier payback than elsewhere.
Okay, that's interesting. Is lack of talent a problem for Bahrain, or the high cost of talent?
Well, Bahrain, obviously I'm going to say Bahrain's a great location to do business, but it's slightly different to the rest of the region in that Bahrainis need to work. I mean, we have this, it sounds almost like a cliche, but it's true. You arrive in Bahrain, your taxi driver is a Bahraini, you go to your meeting, the CEO you meet is a Bahraini. Bahrainis work at every level. So there's no shortage of Bahrainis who want to work. And the talent is improving, and it's all part and parcel of what we're doing to create Bahrain and other places in the region are doing to create this as a real tech hub. You know, the investment into training for individuals, the development and collaboration with university, that's all happening. At the moment, if you look at the Fintech case for the moment, we have 8 graduates who come out of management studies, and maybe only 1 comes out of tech, so we need to shift that balance slightly. But in Bahrain, we're about homegrown talent. And obviously, if you're coming into a country and you want to have longevity and sustainability, you need to be employing local people. We make it easy for people to employ a local person and then cover some of their training costs to get them working how they want to. But Bahrain's actually a cheaper location than the rest of the region anyway. You know, it's considerably cheaper than our neighbours.
So these are edges that you have, these are distinguishing factors.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of 30 to 40% cheaper to run a business out of there, and it's still a tax-free location. So, you know, business costs are generally lower. It's easy to employ locals. Locals want to work. I mean, you look at financial services as a whole industry, it's close to 70% Bahrainis working in our financial services industry. And this after oil and gas is our biggest employer. I mean, within that, 30% of those are then women as well. So there's a lot of homegrown talent and Bahrainis who want to work.
Yeah,
just something else to add to that. Something actually that's quite strange that happened last week when I was in Dubai. Saw that there's this bit of a thing going on now in terms of a lot of the local businesses are trying to raise money globally. Like they spend a lot of time in California. They are really struggling now because of the situation with Iran. So a lot of them are getting to points where, you know, a lot of senior people within very sort of well-known startups who are raising rounds at the moment are starting to look around because they're looking for businesses that are not focused. You know, we are focused in the Middle East, but we're a global business and we have funding outside of the Middle East. So they're looking for businesses that actually are, they want to stay in Dubai, want to stay in the Middle East, but these locally focused businesses are starting to now look quite risky in terms of their longevity and their survival because, you know, it's serious. When you lose a job in Dubai or Saudi, you have to leave your whole family in a month. So, you know, everybody, and we're seeing a lot of applications now from some quite high-profile businesses in the region who are now struggling to raise because of the political climate.
Interesting. So that we talked about that earlier. There's political volatility, political tensions, and it's hitting the startup scene.
Yeah, it's hitting startups, and it's having. So I'm a slightly beneficiary of it, which is a bit weird, but it's just a fact I didn't expect to see when I was out there.
Interesting. Again, we're happy to open up the panel to the audience, and Vizuki's jumped straight in. So if you don't mind, we'll take the mic down to Vizuki, please, and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
And Vasily from Chatham House. One of the views of we've focused a lot on GCC, but one of the views of the panel on the wider Middle East, you know, developments in North Africa, perhaps Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, are they beginning to see benefits from this global tech ecosystem, or they're very much rooted in the past?
Although physically our locations are in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, our capability development work is across most of MENA. Actually in North Africa, mostly Egypt. I think absolutely. I mean, the Levant and Egypt have always been known as like sources of talent. Sometimes to fly and relocate to the GCC, but more and more as let's call it kitchens, as they say in the startup world, for some of the startups that are GCC based, right? So if you're able to have, like Kareem is a good example, right? Kareem had, for the longest time, most of their development work actually based out of Pakistan, right? And that allowed them to find the talent quicker and cost efficiently. Same thing, I see a lot of startups. I work, by the way, very, very granular, not on like, statistics and this type of stuff. I work with actually specific startups, but hundreds of them across the region. Many of the startups have back offices in Lebanon, back offices in Egypt, and sometimes the headquarter is in the region, maybe in Bahrain, maybe in Dubai, sometimes in Saudi, less so in the past, more so will be in the future. So I think the Levant and Egypt ecosystem will grow. For the short period, it will be because they're employed for organizations that are outside as kind of like the outsourced talent, and then that I think on itself will train that talent in those local ecosystems to do more startups. There are some successes in all of those ecosystems. But technically, they're, I think, a little bit further behind and kind of development. The governments have tried to do a lot of stuff, but sometimes botched it, actually.
Please.
If I add 3-4 numbers to your question so that we can place each country onto the map. UAE has the highest number of fintechs, 67, so mid-60s. The second one in the region is Turkey, 44. Then Jordan is a pleasant surprise. It has 30, so half UAE, but it's quite high, given all the other dynamics, economical dynamics in the country. Egypt, much larger country, has 34, so basically the same number as Jordan. Lebanon, 30. So looking forward, it is reasonable to expect definitely a booming in Turkey. 44 for Turkey are too few given the sophistication, especially of their financial services market. And Egypt, again, I would expect it to grow. Reason being because a lot of fintechs focus on the, solving consumer problems. Most of the GCC countries, even Saudi Arabia, which is the largest, is not a huge population. So these fintechs do need countries with tens of millions of potential clients to get the payback and to experiment. So that probably the numerical answer to your question. So where do we expect the growth?
Please, yeah, please.
Just, and Bahrain and other countries within the region are beneficiaries of the success of Egypt and the wider MENA region as well. I mean, we have Flat 6 Labs in Bahrain. They're doing a great job across the whole region. And they're one of our key drivers for tech innovation in the kingdom. Similarly, a number of our startups that have chosen to scale up for the wider region have actually come from the locations you mentioned. Yep. And we have a fund of funds that's outwardly investing at the moment in tech businesses. Now, obviously, there's a very close to home focus on that, but really, right now, they're looking on regional startups and scale-ups who can then perhaps bring more technology back to Bahrain and scale out of there. So that the tie-ups within the region are great, and Bahrain's certainly benefited from the success of those countries.
Have you seen that? I mean, you mentioned Jordan when we were talking earlier, that it's not just the GCC countries and Saudi, it's beyond that, are benefiting from this increase, this focus on digital.
No, absolutely. We work with a number of businesses in the region, and obviously have to work with their teams across, and they're regularly based all over the world. As in, some of the teams, for instance, some of the rocket internet businesses, we're dealing with tech teams in Portugal, but as I mentioned, some of the other businesses like Wadi.com, based out of Pakistan. So yeah, we're seeing, and I guess Egypt's another big one for us in terms of next step as a market. But yeah, we see lots of talent from there as well. But yeah,
there seems to be quite a way to go. We had the digital minister from Lebanon in here a couple of weeks ago, and he said he was given the job. It was newly created. He was the first to unlock the door. He'd hired a handful of people, so there's still quite a way to go before certainly governments in some of those countries get behind it. Next question, please.
Kristen Hawkins, I'm Saudi British Business Council. Very pleased to hear from Alex as the progress he's made in Saudi, which is actually quite the opposite. Normally we find companies go to Dubai first and then come into Saudi, and I think there's a recognition there of the importance of the market and what's going on. We've been very active trying to bring tech entrepreneurs together and taking up missions. I just wanted to ask the panel about their feeling for the sort of entrepreneurial culture out there. I mean, you mentioned, you know, Aramco. I think it was the case. Everyone wanted to work for Aramco or SABIC, but now it is much more fashionable, I think, to start your own business, and there are co-working spaces being developed. Access to funding is still a bit of an issue, but how do you feel the progress, particularly in Saudi, on that front?
Yeah, so just to answer that one, the energy in Saudi is really extraordinary, isn't it? It's a really exciting place to be. And what we've seen is very interesting, and there's a lot of people who take, obviously, very, very proud Saudis, who've been educated in Europe or the US, and they're coming back to Saudi Arabia and setting up really exciting businesses. The issue I have is that there's quite a few, especially in the logistics sector. So logistics is a massive area where improvements needed in a big way, which we're working on as well with partners. There'll probably need to be some pretty swift consolidation because we've just seen the number of businesses there are that are quite at a small level of funding. But yeah, no, there's some really, really smart, switched-on guys who are really passionate about making Saudi a success and are really aligned around the vision. Yeah, no, it's a very exciting space, definitely.
Yeah. Do you see the same increase in the sort of entrepreneurial spirit culture across the region?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, our kind of number of startups are increasing by 40% each year, and that's partly because there is this spirit that's happening, but also it's getting increasingly easier to start a company. And we're seeing companies, startups from around the region then coming to Bahrain to scale up out of there, because Bahrain, as I mentioned, you know, it's tiny. We talk about it as being a test bed. We've got a regulatory sandbox for Fintechs, but for the wider tech scene, it is a whole sandbox, really. Yeah. It's an easy place to set up a business. We have a really good bankruptcy law, which makes it really easy to get out as well now, if you need to. There's access to funding, so there's stuff happening. But those people who are setting up and scaling out of Bahrain, you know, some of those are Saudis and doing fantastic jobs. And we have, obviously, people coming to Bahrain trying to grow a business, ultimately wanting to target the Saudi market. And in time, they will hopefully retain something in Bahrain, but will outgrow our market and lead on to the bigger prize, which is Saudi.
You must be seeing this entrepreneurial spirit and increasing number of individuals keen to start their own companies as opposed to work for the giants in the region.
So absolutely. I mean, I think if you see success and if you see that someone that worked with you in the same firm or, you know, was in the same college went and started a $100 million company and they enjoyed doing it, then it definitely sparks interest and, you know, a bunch of their colleagues, friends, extended family, and even like people who just read about them because this is very relatable. I mean, it's one thing to hear about, you know, Mark Zuckerberg started, you know, Facebook. It's like a very theoretical thing. But when you hear that, you know, X person started and you knew that person, or, you know, you have common friends, then you're like, oh, I can do it too, right? And then the other thing is, I think, you know, the point on talent and capability is, now that we have the large organizations, you know, that are scaling, you know, Karim is thousands of people now, you know, the souks, a bunch of others, that the people that worked in those organizations now learn how to actually start a company, right? Because they see it function, and some of them, you know, started in the first year or second year. They really saw what it takes to build a company. And that's basically how an ecosystem starts. People graduating from successful companies go and start other ones because they learn how to do it. I mean, we're 20 years behind, not because we're, you know, mentally deficient, but because we didn't have startups in tech 30, 40 years ago, like, you know, the Valley did, right? And I think, you know, we're catching up, and I'm super optimistic. But I think that's the component that will make a big difference is, you know, all these graduates going and starting their own ones. And obviously the founders going and investing in these new ventures, right?
Right. You must see that, and the numbers you said earlier about the payback on some of these new fintech startups must be encouraging more entrepreneurs to try to jump into that space.
Yes. Look, talent is scarce. meaning, even ourselves, we struggle nowadays to find the right talent, although having a global recruiting pool. We have 450,000 people. We look in every market. Talent in certain areas, artificial intelligence, data, number crunching is scarce. It's a struggle for everyone. The Middle East benefits, though, by a tradition of attracting people, with all the limitations, etc., into how long visas, etc. But it does have a long tradition of inviting people to come to work, and being flexible into it. If you'd notice, for example, we talked about the relevance of China into the trade flows in the previous session. The UAE's #1 partner is India, actually, not China, especially in the services sector. Now, this is a long answer of saying that we do see a future of the technology sector in the Middle East, a lot into ecosystem with India and Egypt, which is also emerging. So that's the answer to...
Interesting. So you say look into India.
Can I add one quick thing? Just so, because I talk about obstacles and I'm passionate about obstacles, but to underline something here, you can today get an Emirates flight to Dubai, land tonight. Tomorrow morning you wake up, you can register a company. It takes a couple of weeks. And then you issue residency visas for all your team from anywhere in the world, minus like 2 countries, to fly, your CTO from Russia, your head of product from Brazil, and they have residency, for that. And that's a nice thing. I think probably similar in Bahrain, right? I'm kind of like region agnostic. We just happen to have physical presence in Dubai. So I know more about it. But that's really amazing. Because if you are a founder and you want to, you're a Middle Eastern founder, you're from many places in the emerging markets, come and do your company even here or in the US, where I'm more familiar. I spent 10 years in the US. It's like insanely hard to get, the residency and to also get your international team to relocate with you, right? So this is one of the big benefits, right? You can land, you can register a company, and then suddenly you can assemble a team from all over the world, a diverse team.
So they used to bring in international talent.
I wanted to emphasize that because it was a small point, but people might not be aware how easy it is.
So the other thing, I don't intend to make it too long, the other thing which helps a lot, it is having a common lingua franca, English. And again, widely across the Middle East, English, it is fluently spoken. You have people who live for 10 years, do not need to learn Arabic. They speak English the whole time. And again, India, Pakistan, it's again, onto the lingua franca business, which makes it in the innovation area, etc., much easier than in some other geographies where I've been living to kind of, team up and solve the problem in a cost-efficient way, rather quickly enough, with having actually a bench of relevant talent, better than elsewhere.
Okay, so.
Ranjit Gurwal, the chairman of International Consultants. The question that I pose is that we have certain clients who are looking to go into the Middle East, and the challenges that they have is predominantly finding human capital at a high level. It's very, very challenging. So we've suggested to them, rather than looking at America, where the prices are very expensive, to look at Southeast Asia because they can really get quality staff and people. So my question is, in terms of statistics, is there a correlation with Asia and the Middle East in terms of fintech, especially human capital flows?
You mean the wider Asia or Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia. Is there people going
Look,
from Asia
what
to the Middle East?
What we see as a trend into, tech human capital, actually we see quite a lot of professionals coming from North America and Canada back to the Middle East. UAE, Bahrain, I believe, is a good platform. People with roots from Asia, especially the countries which are easier. From Southeast Asia, we do see talent movement in, you got to go by sector, like towards Indonesia in financial services. Saudi banks have been present there. They have a tradition. We do see talent in that space. So it's not generalized with the, with the Far East Asia. With the, the near, what I call the near abroad, etc., we do see talent coming back.
Okay.
Could just say one
Sure,
thing?
please, yeah.
So Bahrain is home to Bahrain Fintech Bay, which is the largest fintech hub in the whole of the MENA region. It was launched early last year. It's been a great success. Local talent, international talent. It's a co-working space, an accelerator, a venture capital program. There's everything happening there, and that's the reason why Bahrain's so successful at the moment. Bahrain Fintech Bay, the management team behind it was a private-public partnership initially. It's now becoming very much an independent being. The management team behind it set up Singapore. It's called the Singapore Fintech Consortium. They're running a hub in Singapore. They now have opened a base in Silicon Valley as well. So Bahrain is very much linked to both US and Asia in terms of fintech. They see the connection. And we have companies coming from Asia regularly to set up, trial their financial services products and other tech as well in Bahrain. So there are huge inflows. I don't have the exact figures, but I can certainly...
You certainly see that connection, that nexus.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that sort of MAS officials are spread sort of fairly liberally in the regulators in the region, but you're seeing flows of companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of going back to Singapore, I mean, Bahrain sort of models itself largely on Singapore's hub anyway, but a lot of our fintech regulation has come from the FCA in London via MAS in Singapore, and then readapted for the regional market.
Okay, so please.
Hi, my name's Brian. I come from SRM, and we are a risk consultancy. And one of the things we offer is cybersecurity services. So I wonder what your take on the cybersecurity scene is in the Middle East. So both at the government level, perhaps, or at the sort of enterprise level.
Yeah, obviously a huge issue is cyber, and it comes up routinely. It's a hot political issue. It's a geopolitical issue. It's, is that where the next conflict's going to be fought in cyberspace?
Look, it's one of the most used words in the last 3 years in the region. Banking sector is the number one, calling for it, but not only. If you look at the statistics, they're, public knowledge. There is an increasing number of attacks reported, a little bit everywhere globally. Actually, last week we were looking at it. The number of attacks in 3 years more than tripled. The global attacks. So there is demand into that. The amount of, going back to the talent, the amount of talent, it is, there is more demand than supply. So that would be my answer. There is more demand than supply in the, and I'm not going to the government sector, so I'm going to leave it out. But even in the private sector, there is more demand than supply of cybersecurity experts.
But cybersecurity...
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously the opportunity is huge.
Yeah.
And our colleagues from the Saudi Britain Business Council here as well. I mean, Saudi has the honour of being, is it the second most attacked nation in the world for cyber attacks? So, that's quite the opportunity is huge for everybody. In Bahrain, we're dealing with it. We have companies who are doing some smart stuff in that space. And we have a great organisation called C5 who have particular growth programs in the cybersecurity space. But the opportunity is huge. It's not just Bahrain, it's the whole region. That's massive.
Yeah.
I would say definitely agree. Like insane demand on the government side, like the largest cybersecurity firms in the world have a footprint from Palantir onwards down to local initiatives that are government / pseudo-government as well to work with public sector to secure stuff. There is obviously a lot of geopolitical sensitivities because there is even in the region some kind of tension and cross-hacking and all this stuff. So part of it is government projects. I think demand is insane, and also like the private organizations are investing much more. I guess I have a question. No one is interested in kind of Middle East pivot to Asia tack on this because there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. Would love to hear questions on that front as well. There's we didn't cover it a lot during the panel, but there's a lot of Middle East to Asia interesting things happening.
We talked about this, the Singapore officials talk about India as being it. Anybody else have a take on it? I mean, you give me your sense. We've touched on Southeast Asia and how the Middle East is interacting there. But as the center of gravity shifts east, is Middle East and Southeast Asia likely to be the sort of tech hotspot as opposed to West Coast USA, to a lesser degree, UK?
So it's not taking away from the, West Coast hotspot. The West Coast, I think, for the foreseeable future, will produce a lot of the successes in the world. Obviously, China is catching up with very large successes. I think what's interesting is what's happening because of the underlying patterns that were discussed in the first panel, right? So there was talk about tourism, for example. There were a question on tourism and a discussion on tourism. Now, a lot of Chinese tourists are looking towards the Middle East. Okay, now you are a business in the Middle East. How are you positioning yourself to attract the Chinese tourists? Besides kind of like the government delegations, but you as a specific business, how are you able to do it? Do you do advertisement on Google and Facebook? No, because they're blocked in China, right? So there's like startups that are focusing on helping businesses in the region access the Chinese market through, obviously WeChat, et cetera, with many new things coming up. And those are kind of like opportunities, right? The underlying pattern is way more Chinese tourists and Asian tourists, but I think we know who the big player in Asia is. And then, so this is the underlying pattern. And then what is happening on the tech world to, for like about the world, take advantage, leverage this for the startup and also for the businesses. So even in retail, right? So the diversification that we talk about in the UAE and in other countries away from oil, there's like tourism is a big driver, right? That's one element. And retail, the same thing. A lot of retail that used to come to Dubai, a lot of Russian and Saudi retail, right? As Saudi Arabia kind of develops their local retail infrastructure, local tourism infrastructure, all of stuff. Some countries are saying, okay, we need to diversify and see what we do with the Asian buyers. So there are even like, technology startups, both from Asia, but also from the region, saying how can we attract retail tourists to the region and how can we do that? So there's like a lot of interesting stuff happening at the ground level to see how these big flows can benefit local businesses.
Yeah, and so how technology can be applied to these new markets. And is that, are you seeing that as well? There's these other shifts playing into technology.
What we've seen from an Asia perspective is, the only way I can sort of talk about it and what I've observed is a lot of the businesses we're talking to obviously have a lot of the e-commerce businesses that have interest in Saudi and have operations, namely sort of Jolly Chic or Shein, the sort of biggest ones there. We just see fluctuations in the size of the team in Saudi, and it's sort of, we never know where decisions are really made. It's actually very clear that decisions are made in China, and sort of we build relationships on the ground there, but then obviously have conference calls with Beijing about decisions. So that's the main, we're seeing increasingly decision-making moving away from the market to China, which is fine because we have presence there as well and we have relationships there and investors, so it's fine, but it's just a trend that we've seen.
Okay. Look, I'm afraid we're out of time. This is a really fascinating conversation. There's so much more we could cover. Very interesting what's happening in Bahrain. You're now looking for another place to land. There could be a deal on stage, but you can conduct that next door away from us. Another fascinating conversation. Please join me in thanking all of my speakers on the panel today.